Okay, so I'm really pleased both of you have come along here today because you both bring real different experiences. You really from a kind of science background, but we'll explore your background a little bit more. And you particularly from a practical background as sort of multi-medalist, so it's not just knowing how to row, it's knowing how to succeed at rowing. And of course you both work together because you've been part of the Sport Foundation, which is a key element in your success and your strength and conditioning and preparation for sporting events. And so we said we'd get together, partly because it's the end of the year and the beginning of a new year, so that's the time when I know you, Rick, will be setting targets for your athletes and indeed for yourself. And again, those athletes will very likely be meeting you to talk about their strength and conditioning and their plans for the year. So, what are your sort of general reflections on sport performance, and what has made each of you good at what you do?
Well, that's a huge subject, Rick.
Man, that's big. Let's rock on. I think one of the big things is probably there's two people in this room, meeting them made a difference to my sporting achievements. Tim, yourself, and John as well, which I met through you, Tim, and just actually going down the route of high performance, which for me, I'm not really an athlete. I would call myself more a rower, but meeting you, seeing you as an athlete, it changed me. It actually pushed me a little bit further forward than what I would have done as an athlete. And then meeting, obviously going through you, and I remember going back to you and I said, well, we were training at the CrossFit at the time and we had to end that place, and I said, come on, we need to carry on with this stuff, and it's quite funny. He said, well, let's go and see John Scriven's, and I think we went to he ran a seminar or something, we went to there, and from there you took us on as older athletes.
What seminar was that? Can you remember the first one?
I don't know, I think there was a small one up St John's Recreation Centre.
In fact, Pete and I were just talking about that the other day. That's right back in the dawn of the Sport Foundation.
Amazing. I was like, I said to Tim after, that guy, he's got some enthusiasm in him, both of you, and it was really, really great. So that really rocked us to you, and you were really good because you took on a couple of older athletes, which wasn't really in your criteria to take on in performance side. But it gave Tim and myself an edge to go forward, which we did. We ended up winning that particularly the following year. We ended up winning the British National Championships in the double sculls, which was like, for us, it had never been held before. So we were really actually there at the right time. And the coastal rowing's has been a lot about that, being there at the right time, doing the right stuff with the right people, and that's what's pushed us. And you gave us that edge. You gave us all the tools we needed to go further.
We recognised that you guys were a motivated motley group and needed some love, really, because if you look at the sports services in Jersey historically, we really haven't seen any, and even the Sport Foundation services at the time were from a charity support perspective. It wasn't from a government perspective. So there's a lot of athletes that have been doing a lot of great things in Jersey for a long time without a lot of support. So we felt, and the organisation's kind of ethos was to give that love to those individuals and wrap some services around that. Of course we wanted to do a lot more, but we were slightly limited in terms of budget and what we could do. But we recognised within the rowers that you guys were dedicated. It was a unique sport that was not specific to Jersey, but Jersey's landscape lends itself quite nicely to coastal rowing. And of course, when you look at rowing, we have a number of rowers that may have been at university or have had background in rowing from Jersey, and that unique application of it on the sea with seamanship skills makes it very island centric. So of course it's a sport that's quite interesting locally. So we were really excited about supporting that, and we've had a long relationship.
Absolutely.
How long was it in the end? I suppose it must have been 7 or 8 years in the end.
I think you may have had one of our first athletes probably 10 years. Probably 10 years. I think Tim and myself started probably, I know Jersey Sports Foundation probably moved out about just over a year now. Probably 8 years, more than likely.
That sounds about right.
Picking up on the sort of raison d'etre behind the Sport Foundation, what in your opinion is the difference between an athlete doing great stuff at home or at the gym and an athlete being part of a programme any program, we can of course refer to the Sport Foundation, but your experience is even broader than just that. You have tremendous experience. What is the difference? What is really important in terms of making that step up?
Yeah, I think that's a recognition that, or a recognition, I should say, of where it goes from an amateur mindset into a professionalised mindset. That doesn't mean you're a professional athlete, but you operate like a professional. So that looks at uncovering every single stone that you can find to try and eke out those performance changes. I think at a jersey level, it's quite interesting. There's a mindset shift, from I just go and do my sport to ultimately at some point that becomes not enough because that's what everyone's doing. And how else can we find ways to develop ourselves mentally, physically, nutritionally, to take us to the next step of performance that we might not be able to just get by simply doing the sport by itself. So I also think it's about being part of a wider, broader community, and taking you up to that next step isn't just about you being on your own anymore, it's about having people behind you to help lift you. And I think fundamentally when we look back to the services that we provided, if I put my finger on probably the most powerful one, it was athlete management, in terms of sitting down with a cup of coffee with an athlete. I mean, if we look at our strength and conditioning services, we had performance psychology, nutrition, performance lifestyle. It was, I think, Rick, we talked about this a lot over the years, and I think this is useful for people sitting and watching this. How do we invest most effectively? We sit down and we support that individual, we help them, because most athletes are out there doing it on their own, and they're amazing. And what a change it is to have a crew supporting behind you. It just takes you to that next level. So I think looking at performance services, it is mentorship, support.
Incredibly, as you say that, thinking of the athletes that I pushed your way or gave them the opportunity with you to have some sort of advanced tuition, all the stuff, and I could see in their faces when I'd say, you get nutrition, you get the psychological, all these things you are meeting, and they were like, they were just like, I didn't know that was available, and it was like, it was a big step. It might have been a small step for other people looking outside from the professional, but for amateur level athletes, it was a huge step, having that available and free. You didn't have to go out and get sponsored to get it. You guys gave it, and I know per athlete it was a lot of money's worth, and we were indebted to the sponsors that sponsored that, and you guys. I could name yourself and Pete and Sam and Paul. And it was loads of them, girls as well, that are coaches. It was really, for me as a coach, it really did help me establish myself. And give me the right tools to go forward.
I'm interested in expanding on this point. I mean, you recently talked on another podcast about sort of biosocial psycho element, which is, and again, just broadening this out, this is in part what you've just been saying. You create an environment, you create a community of support. It's not just about facilities. If it was just about facilities, there are plenty of gyms locally that have fantastic facilities. And you've been running Project Gold, which is helping and supporting the next generation come through. From both yours perspective, the Sport Foundation was more than just great facilities. What is the mental shift? What is the behavioural shift? What is the attitude shift? Because it can be quite divisive. I know from my own sporting background, to be honest, I was quite selfish. I was very, very goal focused and pushed everything else to one side in pursuit of my ambition. And so it's quite difficult to have that community and be selfish, be really driven, but what are your thoughts on that?
We had a range of athletes. I mean, Pete and I did a bit of a project a few months ago about thinking about how many athletes and sports we supported over time. It was over 25 sports, and we talked about hundreds and hundreds of athletes. And during that time, there were a range of individuals. Specifically, remember working with you, of course, with Rick, and quite different personalities. So you have to flex and adapt to all those types of individuals, and not performance services like S&C services don't work for every single athlete. It's not saying that they wouldn't benefit from that, but being in a community of other athletes isn't necessarily always the way to go for. So you have to flex and adapt those services to make it work for that athlete in that individual setting, as opposed to making them fit our program. So we had a range of individuals that didn't come into the gym or the facilities, for example. And I should say the interesting thing about our facilities were they were really basic. And we've had lots of chats about this at quite senior level in Jersey about what facilities are needed for performance sport. And we hear stories about world-class athletes. You think about the Brazilian favelas where they learn to play football, in the worst possible environments. Now we had a reasonable facility, but it didn't need much. Sometimes a bit of blood and guts is good. So we had a very basic facility. What we did, we had a really good support service that wrapped right round that athlete and coach partnership where the rubber met the tarmac. So we were out and we went out to the athletics track. We came down to the rowing clubs and we spent time in the boats. It wasn't really about the facility. It was about the community and almost the non-hard services. It's the soft services that were really important. Sitting down, talking about what does a yearly plan mean. I mean, it was pretty cutting edge in Jersey at the time when this set up, but it was very basic what we were doing. We're just doing as simple as well. So, an annual plan, sit down, and for some coaches, many could do this really well, but some coaches don't think annually. We've got an amazing volunteer coach group in Jersey. And they won't have come from an academic background. They've come from sport themselves, and we know that their experiences they carry through. So annual planning is new to some individuals. So we spent a lot of time with coaches looking, well, how do we structure an annual plan? If we want to get to here, how do we work backwards to get there? So that was a really, really important piece of work. So for an athlete that might not come in to a group environment, we might provide that type of support for. But I would say we had a lot of athletes that had that mindset. And what you find is when you do bring them into facility, and we were doing quite generic training in terms of strength work, because strength training isn't specific. And just so the viewers know, I've spent 20 years in this now, there is no strength training that's specific to your sport. It doesn't work that way, right? So the sport is specific to the sport. So we were doing some general work, and you can argue that argument within nutrition, within psychology, it's relatively general. So when they come in, there's a group of individuals in that facility that are the top in kayaking or rowing or paddleboarding or athletics, the top in judo. So you get this nucleus of high performance mindset where they start learning, developing. It becomes this cauldron of performance, and you drop individuals into that. And yes, there might be the big, ego in their own sport, and they're maybe a bit in a silo, and they might be a little bit individual, not want to work with individuals, but you bring them into that and suddenly they do want to be there, and suddenly now, hang on, that guy's stunning long jump is better than mine, and it just takes into the next level. Hang on, that guy's movement assessment, he can do that, or she's more creative at doing that, or I hadn't even thought about that type of training. What can I borrow from other individuals' mindsets? Not necessarily like the paddle stroke or the specifics, because remember, that's what the sport does. But in the performance community, it's those behaviours that they borrow from each other. And suddenly, that big fish becomes not such a big fish, and we take everyone up to the next level. And that's really what some of the benefits I found from the Sport Foundation were for all individuals, irrespective of where they found an individual benefit from the type of training. It was the community that I found really powerful. And I think, Rick, we talked about that a lot.
I miss that side as well. It helped me as what we were saying about the psychological side of coming through that. I mean, I come from the old background of rowing, and when it was hard, I mean, I was never the best rower. I was one of the top rowers. I was never the best. There was other people out there that could beat me in certain circumstances, but I did find myself, and certainly I've always coached along the line as a rower. I've coached others. You don't have to be a coach, qualified coach to coach. In those days, wasn't that available. But as I matured as a person and I took time out to bring my son up, then I got back into it and realised what I needed to do. But it changed. Everything changed because when you're dealing with athletes, you have to look at them mentally, and you have to be mentally aware of where they are and what they're doing. The whole ball game has changed for me. So just looking at them and being sympathetic on different areas, and actually just working at where you're just trying to get the best out of them. So if they're comfortable with what you're doing and with everything you're doing and the performance is coming, you'll get more out of them.
So, I mean, like John, you work with a number of athletes of different abilities and talents, all part of a broader program. And some just enjoy the rowing and improve.
They do.
And some go on and achieve medals. Okay. What for you are the telltale signs? When can you tell, actually, this person's going somewhere and this person's doing really well, but that's about it?
That's a really difficult one, because they don't always, they go in fits and starts. It's a bit like an athlete, honestly. You tail up to a race and stuff like that. Even this year, I've had one of the athletes, he showed such really good promise at the start of the year, and he did tail off. He had a couple of bad experiences, he or she, and I never got the best out of that athlete this year. I was disappointed with myself more than him. It was a him, by the way. But I was disappointed with myself because I didn't get the best out of him. And I think there was a lot more to come. And I could have never said at the start of the year, I thought I've turned the key on. And I think I did turn the key on, but the key, it never worked all year for me. And whereas others actually progressed through it. A couple of the girls, and they ended up winning some medals at the Brits, which was, fantastic for them. It's like a massive boost for them, it takes them to the next level. And they sort of cracked the code at that particular time. It's like they've cracked the nut. They've won a medal, a national medal, if you like. And for them, doing that was a huge thing. And it goes down to what I've learned at the Sports Foundation and amalgamated that with. And obviously, John pushed me on to doing Project Gold, which you had jiu-jitsu and
originally we had 5 sports, but ultimately the ones that sort of stood the test of time were
and Project Gold still going.
Judo, weightlifting, and rowing.
So a question I have for you, John. I was very lucky to start out as a triathlete when it was very much an amateur sport, and then amateurs could succeed, and I was lucky enough to go to the Commonwealth Games. And frankly, the same with coastal rowing. When we started in coastal rowing, it was still very much an amateur sport. We're now seeing it accepted into the Commonwealths and earmarked for the Olympics. And so the sport will professionalise, the standards will go up, the money will go up, the quality of athletes will go up, and the criteria will go up. What are your views on that transition from amateur to professional sport? Because it can actually exclude an awful lot of people. But it can also be sort of great for the sport and the money and the viewers. I have mixed views. I'm interested in yours.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would have mixed views. I don't think there's a definite answer to that. In terms of my personal view is, I think that, I suppose ultimately, what do we want from sport? And this is a question back to the island as a whole, and not just within Jersey, within lots of jurisdictions around the world. Like, why do we invest in sport? Because ultimately what you're asking for there is an investment. Because to get those changes at the moment from a relatively amateur perspective, and when we say amateur, it's really important to recognise that I know amateurs that are more committed than professional athletes. So we're not saying amateurs we're clear about what we mean, but they're very, very dedicated individuals that don't get paid for what they do. They do it fundamentally because they love it, and they're probably doing it around their full-time jobs and families, which is sort of a different type of setting. Once you start getting into Olympic type levels, I mean, largely for the 99.9% of Jersey athletes, they're not in that setting, excluding professional rugby team that was there. So it's a bit of a different dynamic in Jersey. So it'll be interesting to see the change there. I imagine you'll see a bit of a pull, which may lead... see, when you look at the research, there's this sort of lovely, virtuous thinking that elite performance inspires the next generation to create lots of participation. But the research tells us that it doesn't.
Okay.
So when you look at the legacy of 2012 Olympics, there's less people involved in sport, more physical activity than ever before.
I have to say, is counterintuitive. I would not have thought.
Isn't it? Isn't it? And so we think about this virtuous cycle that elite performance inspires the next generation, which creates more physical activity, which creates more volume of individuals coming through to create more high performance. But it doesn't work like that.
And is that because the standards are perceived as impossible, unobtainable, and of course money will be a barrier to entry for a lot of people?
Yeah, all of the above. I think fundamentally that it's exclusive. It needs a huge amount of funding to make it happen. I think I read, and don't quote me on this, guys, but I think it's something to create a medal at the Olympics, a GB team, costs over £1 million. So it's a huge investment, and culturally it's a huge investment. So it goes back to my initial statement at the beginning of this conversation: is what is it that we actually want from sport? Recognizing that elite sport doesn't always do the things we think it does. There are elements that are really important. There are economic benefits to elite sport. You know, we look at the Seoul '88 Olympics. If we think there wasn't a World War III, there was, but it was just fought on the athletics track as opposed to it being fought on the fields of Europe. The Seoul '88 Olympics was an absolute microcosm for the superpowers. And you look at the Eastern Europeans through the 80s and early 90s, and the state-sponsored doping and all those aspects, the amount of money that's gone into technological sport. We know that, probably going slightly off topic here, that war, particularly a Third World War, probably was absolutely unthinkable and wasn't possible because of the technology that's developed on that side. So a lot of that national prowess, that national pride, what makes us look good internationally, what means our economic minister could go and do a big meeting and say, look what we did, we've got this. It does make the country look better, it makes it more investable in. So certainly there are those types of reasons for investment in performance sport, and they're absolutely fine, but let's just be honest about it. And I think we need to be clear about what performance does and what it doesn't do, and look at the real evidence and be evidence-based about that, because this sort of nice, fluffy, altruistic thinking that it does this, well, if the evidence tells us it does it, that's fine, but there's real conflicting evidence about that. So I think we have to be very clear as to what and why. But I think, you know, sometimes performance sport, particularly around facilities, it can help us have that facilities conversation. It can help develop those things. It can also, I still personally think there's a little bit of pull from the top. You know, I certainly think from, you know, that coaching information that we get, that knowledge, that understanding, it dribbles down to the level 2 and the level 1 coaches, and that pulls them up, and it just raises the standard within the coaching infrastructure. But I think, you know, personally, I think performance is a byproduct of good coaching environments. And what I'd really like to see, particularly at local level sport, why we do it, is because it gets people excited about activity and movement. It's a vehicle to express movement through, creativity, and it gives us a slight break from the monotony of other aspects of life. And I think that's really, really important. And I think then the performance becomes as a byproduct of getting the mix right at the developmental stage.
I want to come back to that point about movement and potentially multi-sport and cross-sport and different areas. But just working on what we've just been talking about, Rick, you've seen a significant difference in rowing from being an amateur sport to increasingly becoming professional in terms of approach and standards. And you're part of a rowing club that looks after a youth academy, a masters rowing, there is community rowing, there's beach sprints, there are every element that you could think of doing in a rowing boat is done within the Jersey Rowing Club. I mean, what's your lived experience? What's been really great about increasing professionalism? What has caused you concern? How does that work?
I think the benefits from, you know, going up, we get better equipment. I mean, the boats and all that are much more high tech. They're easier to maintain. There's probably more speed within them, and they're all same design. You know, they're all within a design structure, and they're supposed to be weighted and stuff like this and that. So they're much easier to adapt per athlete, because some athletes got strong, tight hamstrings, and you've got to adapt the boat around, obviously spreads for them, and all these types of things are much easier. So that beneficial side is the equipment, and obviously the kit and all that's become better. So breathes and stuff like this. So we got a range of stuff with equipment that's made it easier for the athlete to access what we're doing. The downsides, obviously I see it, the focus is coming more with the professionals, because obviously that's where the money is. Most things I see, I didn't know what John had said there about the downturn in professionalism when it goes to the Olympics and that, and then there's a downturn in sport.
I think this is going to be quite probably get people quite reactive, because we have these inbuilt biases. We just assume. But one question I would put out to people that are listening is: have you ever looked at the evidence? Have you ever looked at the evidence? Have you guys ever looked at the evidence?
No, this
no,
was
exactly.
a surprise to me.
And that's the point. It was a surprise to me because I'd lived in that fluffy world for a long time. And I'm not saying there's absolutely zero evidence of that. Let's just be clear, I'm not saying that. But it's conflicting and it's not as strong as you think it should be. And there's many examples of where it hasn't worked. And it's not as strong as it should be for the amount of investment that it gets in terms of inspiring performances. I mean, we've got a strategy called Inspiring. You know, so I think I'd like to see more evidence around that. I'd like us to be much more abreast of that and very clear as to why we're doing these things. And I think we need to go almost back to ground zero on that and look at what the evidence is telling us it actually does and how it does it. It's not always the way that we think it is. So I had a big reality shock learning that.
I could actually see the professional side disconnecting a little bit from the amateur side. You know, there being a disconnection. I mean, we've been so lucky. I've been so lucky to be able to sit. You know, there's not many sports you can do that. You can, you know, you train as hard as you can, and you end up on the start line, and you've got Olympians around you and world champs. And sometimes you get the chance to beat them. You know, if it's rough weather, that's my kudos. You know, I've got some of that. But you know, as I'm getting older, I can't do that with all the youngsters I've been training. They're all fast and they're on the flat water now, and that's difficult to chew on. So I have to take them out in the rough now and again and establish myself a bit again. But it's quite funny at an amateur level. We have been really lucky, but I think that's just drifting away. And you can see that in a couple of competitions. Certainly the Monaco one is now more or less all professionals, you know, and they do shout it up. They say, you know, 21 Olympians, you know, 12 gold medalists, and you've got all that, and it's fantastic. Don't get me wrong, it's beautiful for the sport. But how about bringing the old Monaco race back, where everyone could go down there and race with these guys? You know, now it's unattainable because you won't be able to do the same as what they're doing, you know. So it is moving away. You can see the beach sprints moving away. They've categorised that now. So you've got would be the federation, and then you've got the amateurs. You know, you can still row for your country, but that's all shifting away, and that's FISA's driving that as well. There's a few people driving it, and that will come.
That's really sorry, Tim. That's really interesting, because when we spoke with Ricky, we sat down, we looked at rowing, because I think naturally, you know, it was safe to assume that's quite an interesting sport locally to invest in. We had limited resources and we had to be quite savvy with our investment. And you know, when you look to, we want to put money everywhere, but when we sat down with rowing, that made sense. And then we said, well, let's look at rowing and sort of give it a bit of a health check in terms of performance. I don't mean in terms of the business of it, just the performance of it. I think when we looked at it, we recognised that, you know, as there is in many aspects of sport, even at the elitist levels, and by the way, when I've worked, you know, at really world champs, there's still quite archaic processes happening in terms of training. It was interesting watching the UFC this weekend, and Tony Ferguson, I don't know if you saw that, using David Goggins as a fitness coach, and the type of approach he took. There's still a lack of almost science sometimes with these things, and that will probably infuriate a few people, but it's an interesting one to look at. When we looked at rowing, we said, how do we strategically invest in this? We've got a small pot of money, how do we make it go the furthest? And we looked, well, let's look at World Championship rowing in terms of the distances and the types of speeds. Let's remove all the emotion from it and just look at it. Well, you know, we recognised that it was a 4K and a 6K race. But yet we were training for it like we were training for a marathon. You know, we were doing Sark to Jerseys, and that was the culture of Jersey, and that's brilliant. But it's a different event.
Absolutely.
And I think the challenge was to look at this almost a little bit scientifically and say, well, you wouldn't train a marathon for a 100-meter sprinter. That's probably not fair. At 800 meters for a sprinter, they would do sprint type phase. So we changed that thinking quite a lot. And when we looked at investment, we recognised that the Coastal Rowing World Championships was really the bit that was the investable piece. It was the performance piece. It was going somewhere in terms of British, Euros and Worlds. And then of course more latterly the beach sprints and you know the guys, in particular Des, you know, those guys have done a really great job on that. So when you look at performance investment locally, Jersey's so unique because you can't just pick up a sports model from somewhere else and just plonk it in Jersey. Lots of people think you can. You can't. It doesn't work that way. We've inherited, you know, 200 years of sport culture where largely they've been doing it on their own without any performance support. It's, for me, it was a real honour to work locally as a sort of performance manager and as a director, because there's nowhere quite like it. There are different belief structures, there's different stages of mastery in terms of what performance means. There are resistances because we've done it our way for a long period of time. It's been amateur for a long period, so that almost sometimes people don't feel like they want to be professionalised. So yeah, it's really, really unique. It was certainly exciting. I think we kind of got a formula in the end that worked really well.
Yeah, definitely.
A light touch formula which produced a good dividend on the investment that we put into it. So I don't just make, that's not a financial investment. I'm not talking financial. I'm talking about emotionally and performance outcome as well. And it was that little nucleus of just making a small few tweaks that were already, and they did brilliantly. Yeah.
One of the things you talked about a little earlier, you talked about mobility. And I transferred into rowing having been a triathlete, and triathlon was a very new sport then, and actually triathletes were effectively ex-swimmers and ex-cyclists. And so you're quite pro this idea of not necessarily being committed to one sport, but actually having the range of talent, and maybe having a multi-sport background in terms of physiology and stuff like that. Tell me about that.
Oh God, how long have we got here? I've come a long way as a practitioner. I think, you know, initially I would have sat on the camp, probably even to maybe 5 years ago, I would have sat into the camp quite a lot, saying that multi-sport background is absolutely essential. I'd now changed that to multi-movement background. Sport isn't always that effective developing movement, and this is the big light bulb that's gone off for me for the last 5 years, is that sport, and if we're talking about performance or elite sport, it's not very healthy. In order to become elite, you have to throw everything out. It has to be a really tight, narrow, deliberate focus or deliberate practice focus, if we want to talk about the scientific literature, of crafting or mastering that craft without any other possible interference. And that's how we get good at something. That's the process of attaining sports mastery. And the reason why there are performance services is not because we necessarily try to power that up, is almost we try to add variability to that. Because if all you do is one thing, one time, think about rowing, we're working flexion and extension in the sagittal plane. And for the people that don't know planes, it's just the forwards and backwards plane, like running is. Or so we tend to see a lot of lower back stuff in rowing, right? You guys have probably been aware of that yourselves. Although Rick, I think this guy was solid and didn't have too much. But the purpose of our performance programs, particularly for amateur athletes, wasn't really to make them better physically, was to keep them going physically and adding variability. The best ability at an amateur level is availability. So you can keep going in deliberate practice. And it goes back to my comment before, which might have riled a few people up, that there is nothing in the gym that we can do that's necessarily that specific. And if people sell you that, they're wrong, I'm afraid. It's about keeping the athlete available for training, because specific training is the thing that makes them the best. But we're fighting fires with that, because the athlete that's come into us is already, 5, 10, 15 years down the road, and they already have a tight, narrow focus. So I'm bringing us back around to your question, Tim. I now think that not necessarily a multi-sport background, but that's really effective still, and it still produces really good movers. So young people coming through that have sampled a range of different sports. It's brilliant. It's way better than not. As I said, sport in itself is a kind of a tight, narrow focus, and it's not responsible for developing physical literacy. It's part of developing physical literacy. So the physical literacy piece is now the area that I'm really, really interested in. And this is about creating variable, adaptable, natural, and efficient movers. And the natural piece is really, really interesting because sport isn't natural, right? So it's not, you know, we know it for the specialism reasons, but even if we're a generalist specialist in sport, it's still not that natural. And I was a huge advocate, and still am a huge advocate for gymnastics, for martial arts, for developing well-roundedness in young athletes. But I've almost had to check myself a little bit with that, because even those sports, as great as they are, I'm not a hater, I love them, right? They do the things that we want them to do, but remember, to get good at gymnastics, it's still a tight, narrow focus. Basic gymnastics at a young level is awesome, but I'd almost take it back one step further than that and say, what do humans need to do as movers first? Now, you look at a baby as they learn to move during otogenesis, which is the first year of development, that neurodevelopmental framework. They crawl, they roll, they step up, they stand, they squat. And you look at what our ancestors did through the last 5 million years worth of evolution. They crawled, they rolled, they sat down in bottom positions, sat on the floor, made things, they object manipulated, they fought, they swam, and movement was embedded into their work life. You couldn't separate them, they were totally interlocked. Now we've got to a situation where work and school is separate from movement. You don't need to do it. So what we tend to do as adults, we tend to work all day and then go and binge on exercise in the evening, where we need to ultimately try to rework movement back into our daily lives and almost look back at our ancestry for that 5 million years of evolution, the stuff that our bodies were designed for. In fact, there's some neurophysicists or neurologists believe that the only reason our brain developed as it did was for complex adaptable movement, and the cerebellum, which is totally, this is a little hindbrain, they call it secondary brain, that its one mission, or its main purpose, is for vestibular function, complex motor skill development, for balance, for orientation, for movement basically. And that contains 80% of all the brain's neurons in a small little area. So it's really important that we nurture that. And it's interesting when you look at people that don't move, like I'll ask you a question, if someone doesn't move for a long period of time, what do you notice happens to them, just their aura, you know, if they don't move?
Sedentary, eventually you get muscles atrophy, etc. And
absolutely,
because the mind-body is a connected system, of
absolutely,
course, your thinking changes, and this is why we see an awful lot in well-being and mental health, the importance of exercise, whether it's walking, cold water swimming, getting out there and doing something.
Exactly right. So it's that monomist view as opposed to looking at the philosophy of dualism. It's this monomist philosophy approach where the brain and the body are totally connected. And we now see that in the evidence that complex, adaptable, natural movement nourishes our brain. And you can't have it without it. So going to gym on a recumbent bike is great for someone that's had an injury, but it's not going to stimulate the brain in the way the brain was designed. And it's not going to stimulate our joints. It's not going to get the mechanotherapy or the mechanotransduction. So our ligaments, joints, bones, tendons, fascia, it needs different types of three-dimensional stress, so shearing and pulling and push compressive forces to get nutrition to be healthy. And from, if we use the nutrition analogy as a really useful one, that protein's healthy, but if you only eat protein, you get unhealthy, right? So what we tend to do is we don't move all day, and then we say I'm a cyclist, right? And all I do is cycle. It's healthy to a point, but it becomes unhealthy eventually because I do so much of it. It's like I start eating a bit of protein, then I eat lots, and it then dominates all of my diet, my movement diet. And suddenly, then it becomes unbalanced. We've got that inverted U of effectiveness and non-effectiveness depending on dosage. So what I recognise, and we're kind of coming back around to the original question, was when we want to develop good athletes, they need to be good movers first. So even before we think about sport and all those things, are our young people moving the way they're designed to move? And they're not. even as adults, we can still think about that. We still need to move in the way that nourishes our body, and just recognise when we are binging on X or creative. Binging is another way of calling it a tight, narrow focus. And sometimes we'll focus on capacities like cardiovascular injuries or strength training. And Tim, your background massively on the cardiovascular side. And you see, when you do that, well, you say, well, what about the force production characteristics? What about the bone density and mineralization through stress? Like, so there's a lack of mechanotransduction there, or movement skill. And then if you think about someone that's come from a strength training background, they don't have the capacity component, the cardiovascular health component. You say, well, there's a lack of balance there as well. So it's about effective cross training and making sure that our movement diet, because movement drives a burst. Everything was, whether it's cycling, whether it's judo, whether it's whatever, the common denominator is movement. And it's getting good at movement first in a natural way, and then applying specializations. But don't apply specialization first. Classic example would be someone like Tiger Woods with a narrow focus to start off with. I suppose that's not the best example because he does a range of training. But someone that focuses on, say it's rowing from 8 years old, or ultimately from a performance perspective, it won't augment high performance because they don't have the other movement skills that are important to creating the ability to pick up more advanced techniques, adapt when it's rough water, move the boat when you need to sprint with it, or have the tissue and tendon capacity to be able to absorb high shocks, those types of things. So we need to develop really well-rounded movers that have the mental, social, and physical capacity to tolerate lots of different types of movement, which then augments a higher level of performance. So we want to develop super children. We need to get them moving really well as natural movers, and then I think drip them into things like gymnastics and martial arts, all those things that are really great for creating those athletic qualities and mindsets, and then a slightly later specialization into sport. Fundamentally, the question you asked at the beginning, what's my observations over 20 years working in performance, is we specialise too young and we compete them too young, when we should be focused on creativity, natural movement, play, and fun, and well-rounded movement skills.
Ricky, picking out a couple of points from that, from your experience, you work with older athletes as well as the sort of the young coming through, and in my own experience, actually, one of the key things, and John's mentioned this, is actually injury prevention. As you get older, you can still perform, but you need longer periods of recovery, and you definitely need to start thinking about injury prevention, and you mentioned things like tight hamstrings and stuff like that. How do you adjust either your personal training or those for whom you're a coach to sort of accommodate the realities of life?
Prevention of injuries is obviously a big thing. It normally, if we're out on the boat and that, we do warm-up exercises. That would be, every time. And we got a sequence we go through, as I put them through, because the stuff we do on the water, we do, different exercises that help us, legs only and stuff like that. That actually help us switch on those bigger muscles and that. But I know as older athletes, we take a lot longer to warm up. Personally, myself, if I get in a boat, I want to be racing at least. I need to do 10 minutes rowing beforehand, rather than get on it straight away. Some of the youngsters like to do that, and they probably won't get injured when they're young, but as you get older. But again, to what John was saying, in a range of movements. Personally, myself, I know when I've been at John's gym at the Jersey Sports Foundation there, my flexibility is probably a lot better than most of the youngsters, and I think we've done that a couple of times. And a lot of the youngsters,
I think we embarrassed quite a few.
They were very grumpy with me later on.
But that's an example of you seeing someone like Rick in that training environment, that performance environment, and they're like, "Oh goodness, how's Rick doing that?" And it brings them along. But
it's going back to what I did when I was a youngster. I did a massive amount. I did karate, I did running, I did motocross. I did underwater hockey, diving. cycling, all of that. I did all those things when I was really young. Football and, some of the sports I wasn't, and I picked rowing out of all of them and I carried on doing rowing. And I did lots of other sports alongside it. I never stopped doing other sports as well.
I mean, building on that point, I'm the same generation as Ricky. I sort of grew up running around and riding my bike. Perhaps that was the sort of starting point. But we now have a generation that are less active. There are arguably less facilities, certainly sporting facilities in schools have gone down. My passion was racing the bus to school, either as a sort of run or on a bike. Nowadays everyone's going to get a lift to school. We spend our time on game stations and stuff like that. My thinking may be wrong here, but I'm assuming a solid foundation like Ricky's as a youth, you can then bank later if you choose to return to sport. If you don't have that solid foundation, is the next generation doomed, or is there still stuff that we can do?
Absolutely, you just hit the nail on the head. Those things, those post-war sort of generation that went out and didn't have the technology, almost in austerity, we developed creativity, and we're not really in a time, although some might argue in a time of austerity, but relative austerity is nowhere nothing like that, and we have so much, but by having so much, it's stopping the movement. So where is the movement? Where is the play? Where is the risk taking? I was an 80s baby. I think I was probably the last generation that kind of came off the back of our forefathers that did all this really great stuff. So knock and run. Think about knock and run. You creep up, so you have to be quiet, absorb the force, crouch down, hide, knock, and then run as fast as you can. Kids don't do this, it's not good. We're not advocating it. I'm just saying from a mechanical perspective and a psychological. But there's a fear component to it, there's an evasion component to it, there's a hiding and crouching and moving different spaces component to it. We did a lot of that. Tree climbing, base building, fighting. Fighting, I'm not advocating fighting again, but it is something that's in our DNA, particularly romping and rolling. And if you look at toddlers, they do it naturally. And what I was interested in listening to you guys as you were talking just then, is you weren't talking about sport, you were talking about play. And that's really profound. This unstructured, creative, natural play that you see animals doing in the wild. If you look at some tiger cubs out in the savannah, they're playing around and romping and chasing each other and biting. It's actually what they're designed to do. And by doing that, it beds in some of the fundamental skills that they're starting towards mastery of what they need to do as adults. But we've taken that away as children because we don't need to move now as adults, because we've outsourced movement to automation, to cars, to all the things you mentioned. And that is a problem from a sport perspective. So when we look at the programs that I've run in the past for our youth program, we had big youth programs, 90% of what we did with this youth program, it was about giving them that back, but not in a semi-structured, playful environment. And the weakness of what we did as kids was that although it was unstructured play, which is so important for children, there wasn't a consistency of development. So it's fine when you're young and you go out, but now they get such inconsistent exposure to that. We're almost going to have to make that consistency of exposure, but keep in mind that play, that risk-taking, creativity and movement efficiency or movement skill that we got vicariously by accident, that doesn't happen anymore. So modern coaches now have to embed that within their programs, and that's what physical literacy means. It's about developing those experiences, those movement skill experiences, and it's not about capacities and big weights or anything like that. Movement skill is the foundation of movement capacities. That's what we learn to do. Look at kids. Little kids don't get fit by going out for a run. They get fit through playing and being creative and playing games with their friends. Fundamentally, that's what we need to install back in our young people. We need to keep that thread going through. And then as they develop, we take a little bit more consistency into certain areas that are relative to physical activity or sport later on. It becomes a little bit more specialised, but we keep that play, that creativity going. So what does that look like on the shop floor? That looks like exploring different types of movement and cultures. So we looked at breakdance as an example. It's really interesting. And it's not the sport I'm interested in, it's the movement skills it develops that I'm interested in. And we looked at martial arts. Again, I'm not necessarily interested in martial arts, the sport. I'm interested in the skills and the links that develops the reduction of fearful of being close to someone and being in proximity and understanding where you need to shift your centre of gravity to make someone move. And it teaches a lot without having to sit down in a classroom and learn about it. It teaches us through movement about what that means and how to apply it. It's about going out and getting them to actually sprint and run and climb and crawl and play around with kettlebells and do all these things that actually, we might have been out in the woods lifting logs and building bases, but they don't do it anymore. So we almost have to, sadly, it's great to get children and encourage them when they're young to go out and do that. But in terms of our athlete preparation programs, those children that will have naturally specialised from 11 years old, and it happens all the time, it's getting younger and younger, not getting later and later. Our programs have to change to almost provide that loco parentis kind of support that they might have got when they were young, and teach them to take those risks and learn to love creative movement. And by doing that, if you think about creative movement being the roots of the tree and the trunk being the capacities, the bigger the roots, the thicker the bandwidth for the trunk and the higher it goes. And the higher it goes and the thicker the trunk, the bigger the branches will be. And what the branches mean is flourishing in sport and in life and physical activity. It's basically physical literacy. So bigger the base of the triangle, if you want to use that analogy, the higher the peak. And we push up from the beginning, don't just pull from the top. So I think in the future directions of youth development programs, it is very much around developing that movement, creativity and play.
Okay, this has been a fascinating, really enjoyable conversation. For those that listen or watch the podcast, okay, what would be your parting lesson, advice, reflection? What would you share as something that's important that you've learned along the way?
I'd say the main thing, if you're a young athlete, come to Project Gold for starters, in Jersey or wherever. I think one of the biggest things I've found is consistency in what I've done and getting the youngsters to do. If they do it consistent, I'm not the best coach in the world by a long chop. I do my best, but what I do supply them with is an environment that's conducive for performance and learning skill sets, which I'm very good at teaching. I tend to mentor my youngsters as much as I can because I think I have a great feeling in the boat. I can feel, when we're in rough water, I can feel what they're doing and stuff like that. So yeah, the consistency is probably, if you can hit the consistency, you are going to get better, no matter whether you're a not very good coach or a good coach. Put them in that environment and you're definitely going to go.
John, your key reflection?
I was just thinking, I'd need to sit down and write these down, but one of the things is that you need to be part of a culture, particularly as a performance athlete, a group of individuals. The biggest benefit of Sport for Nation was the family of performance, the culture it develops, and it brought people along. And we've got so many examples of people that would have dropped out the sport if they didn't have that family, particularly those individuals in individual sports as opposed to group-based sports. So the training pack is so important. If that isn't there, it's very, very difficult to keep that individual, particularly as they go from 16 through to 21, 22. It's very, very tough. I think that performance is an outcome, or performance is probably almost a happy accident of getting a really good behaviours and processes in place. So I try not to think of with individuals, right, you're going to be a Commonwealth Games athlete. It's get them to fall in love with the sport, get them to absolutely make the habit of being a performance-minded individual, lay all those foundations down, get simples done really well, and the performance will come as a result of it, not the focus. I focus on performance for a lot, and it's ultimately it ends up not working. It's the behaviours that are more important. So is that individual turning up on time? Do they really understand why they're doing things? Do they have advocacy in their coaching journey? Are they part of the process of decision making? Do they get to make choices about what they do and how they do it? Do they have the movement repertoire that will remove any glass ceilings in the future? Glass ceilings are a really, really important thing. So Another one that's absolutely important from a performance perspective, performance starts, or it's setting the stage performance when it counts begins when it doesn't. Does that make sense? Yeah. And it's in those youth development years when they have those really important experiences. By the time that individual's 18 or 19, everything is almost done. It's then about a different type of management with that individual, about supporting them. And Ricky mentioned this earlier, and I think it's a really important point, that performance athletes, particularly at an amateur level, it's not all singing, all dancing, high-level research and fancy gizmos on a screen. It's those basics done well. Can we help that individual? Are they struggling in a relationship? Have they got enough money to do the sport? Have they got a coach? Because a lot of athletes, you are unbelievable to us from outside of Jersey when we look in. A lot of our athletes don't have consistent coaching, and the coaches that might be having would be potentially individuals that have fallen into it by a happy accident almost, and they are full-time in something else. It's not their primary focus. They do it because they're absolutely committed and devoted, and it's supporting those individuals and wrapping that support around the coach and athlete, and that's what I'd like to be seeing a little bit more locally.
Thank you both very much indeed.
Yeah, thanks Tim.
Thanks.